small towns in rural America. They came from big cities across the land. They joined to fight for liberty and the freedoms they did not have.
Wow, there is nothing quite as fun on a beautiful sunshiny day as loading up my car and just taking the time to go out to the beach. That's a great thing about where I live in Florida. You can just load up anytime you want. I just looked at the beautiful weather, so I'm going to the beach. Wow, it's going to be a great day. Freedom is all about going where you want and when you want to. In South Florida, the beaches are absolutely beautiful. They're open to everyone who wants to enjoy the day. There's nothing better than a day soaking up the sun with my wife. The water is so relaxing. My grandson loves to go to the beach and have a picnic lunch. What a special time for him. Most of us don't know what it would be like to lose our liberty and freedom. But we do remember the graphic images of September 11th, 2001. Our nation was under attack. Our liberty had been breached. Our personal freedom was threatened. I shall never forget watching the second plane hit the Twin Tower. Most of us had never experienced anything like this in our entire lifetime. But 7 decades ago, the people of Europe were stripped of their liberty and their freedom as Adolf Hitler led Nazi Germany into a plan to dominate the entire continent. The people of Europe looked on as their homes, their businesses, and their schools were destroyed by the Nazi war machine. Their freedom had been lost, and they needed a liberator. Their liberators came from England, Canada, and America. These liberators were not professional soldiers, but were men who left their jobs to become citizen soldiers. They would go to Europe and restore freedom. As President Truman said, our debt to the heroic men and valiant women in the service of our country can never be repaid. They have earned our undying gratitude. America will never forget their sacrifices. This is the story of PFC Harold B. McCarn. His story is emblematic of the 93,298 men who are buried in the foreign countries that they died to free. This is James Weatherly, the second cousin of PFC Harold B. McCarn. I was born 12 years and 10 months after the German surrender in World War II. Obviously, I never knew Harold, but I knew his family very well. As a young boy, I loved to play Army. I would beg my mom to buy me the latest Army toys. I'd pretend that our unit was capturing a bridge or a fort while defeating the Germans. Growing up, we watched all sorts of war films like The Battle of the Bulge, The Bridge at Remagen. They were the blockbusters during our day. World War II was still fresh on people's minds, but strangely, the men who fought in World War II would never talk about it. You knew that your uncle, your cousin, or neighbor fought in the war, but they never talked about it. As a kid, you simply didn't ask about the war. I came from a very large extended family. We had lots of family members who'd been affected by the war. My mom was one of 8 siblings. Her mother, my grandmother Craven, was a Stout. Her father, John Edward Stout, had 13 kids. One died as an infant, but the rest grew and had large families of their own. With so many relatives, we didn't distinguish between my aunts and uncles or my mom's aunts and uncles. One of my favorites were Aunt Nina and Uncle Bernice. I didn't know their last name was McCarn because I only knew them as Aunt Nina and Uncle Bernice. After World War II ended, my dad completed his involvement with the Manhattan Project and moved to Atlanta, Georgia. Most of our family was from North Carolina. Aunt Nina and Uncle Bernice McCarn had moved from North Carolina to Baltimore, Maryland during World War II to work for the Glenn L. Martin Aircraft Company. They had 3 children, Harold, Jewel, and Charles. When Jewel got married, she moved to Gainesville, Florida. Our home in Atlanta was situated about halfway between Gainesville, Florida, and Baltimore, Maryland. Frequently, Aunt Nina and Uncle Bernice, or Jewel's family, the Reeves, were guests at our home while I was growing up. But I remember, as a child, my mom talking about one who was not there. Harold was a playmate of my mom's growing up. She told me how she liked to play with Harold and another cousin, Lucille, but Harold had been killed in the war. As a child watching war movies, I didn't know that people really died, much less people in my own family. I have vivid memories of my mom sharing about Harold. She was very moved by the death of her first cousin in 1945. When I was about 10 years old, my mom made a trip to Europe to visit Harold's grave. Harold had been buried in Belgium for over 20 years, and nobody in our extended family had ever been to visit his final resting place. I remember how moved I was even as a child. I understood that Harold had died fighting to protect my freedom. My mother made a black and white photograph of Harold's grave. She wrote me a postcard telling me about her journey. When she returned, my mother took the photograph to Baltimore and gave it to Aunt Nina and Uncle Bernice. It was the first picture that they had ever seen of Harold's grave. My mom told Aunt Nina what a beautiful place the cemetery was. That experience became embedded deep in my mind. It moved me in such a powerful way that I would never forget the sacrifice that Harold had made. Now fast forward 40 plus years. My dad had passed away in January of 2011, and I had just finished relocating my mom back to the area where she grew up in North Carolina. I was back at work and had a few days in Europe to enjoy before continuing to my next assignment. I had taken the train from Liège, Belgium to Luxembourg City to film for an upcoming travel video. As I rode through the beautiful countryside of northern Luxembourg with its streams and hills, I had no clue that my second cousin's unit, the 60th Armored Infantry Battalion, had been in a life or death struggle with the Germans during the bitter winter of December 1944. As my train arrived, I simply marveled at the picturesque city. I began to walk up the street, taking pictures of the buildings. As I approached the first bridge, there was a wonderful building. I took a picture of it. On the side of this building was a plaque that said General Omar Bradley had used this same building for his headquarters during the liberation of Luxembourg in 1944 and 1945. I didn't think anything of it. I snapped the picture and continued on towards the first bridge. Then from out of nowhere, I began to think about my second cousin Harold and the stories that my mom had shared about him when I was a child. Next, a thought flashed across my mind. I need to record something about Harold for my family. It was nothing more than a passing thought. I walked across the bridge, and on the other side of the bridge stood a monument commemorating the liberation of Luxembourg City in September 1944. When I saw that monument, I was brought back to a time over 40 years ago. I could hear my mother as she recounted the story about visiting Harold's grave for the first time.
Well, I remember I went on public transportation.
Oh, the train. Okay.
Because I got off here and got on this.
Right, yeah.
You know, I could read the signs and my map and knew where I was headed.
Okay.
So I looked at the map and I looked at the sign and I said, this is it, I got to get off.
I got to get there.
And I bought some flowers and took. And as well as I remember, it may have been raining.
Yeah.
A little
drizzly, yeah.
I took some pictures, and I didn't think they would turn out, but they did turn out well, and I gave them to Aunt Nina. Saw somebody that told me where he was buried and so forth.
Right.
And I thought it was a nice-looking place and so forth, and told Aunt Nina it was nice. I wouldn't worry about moving him.
Right.
But I'm sure she was glad to see them. And
all of a sudden, I snapped back to reality. Looking out over the bridge, I made an immediate decision that I would take the time to visit Harold's grave and document it for my family. In my mind, it would be a very simple process. I would locate his grave and take a few pictures. But then I became panic-stricken when I realized that I only knew his first name, Harold. To me, Harold's parents were simply Aunt Nina and Uncle Bernice. I didn't know their last name. I knew my Aunt Nina's maiden name was Stout, but I had no clue what Uncle Bernice's last name was. I was horrified that on my watch Harold's sacrifice might have been forgotten. Words cannot explain or express the feeling that overwhelmed me in that moment. I boarded the train for my return trip. On arrival at Liège, I contacted my wife. I asked her to call my mom and see if she could remember Harold's last name. My wife remembered me sharing the moving story about Harold, but she doubted that my mother's failing memory could recall his last name. A couple of days passed. I'd gone to Maastricht in the Netherlands. It was also a town that the U.S. Army had liberated in September 1944. I went to one of my favorite places to eat lunch. As I was enjoying my pannenkoek, a Dutch pancake, my BlackBerry alerted me with an email from my wife. The email said that my mom remembered his name, Harold B. McCarn. She thought that he was buried in Belgium. I went to work immediately while finishing my lunch. After only 1 hour of using my BlackBerry and the internet, I found him. PFC Harold B. McCarn, killed in action March 16, 1945, and buried at the Henri Chapelle American Military Cemetery in Belgium. I began to weep profusely when I learned that Harold was buried only 30 minutes from my European flying base in Liège. I decided at the next available opportunity that I would go and visit Harold. I did follow through with the promise that I made in Luxembourg to visit the Henri Chapelle American Military Cemetery at my next opportunity. The Henri Chapelle Cemetery is located in Belgium. Some U.S. soldiers who were killed in action during 1945 were buried in Germany at several temporary American military cemeteries, but their remains were relocated to the military cemeteries outside of Germany after Memorial Day 1945. The Henri Chapelle American Military Cemetery is located east of Liège, Belgium. On a detailed map, you can see the location to the north of the E40 motorway. On my first visit to Henri Chapelle, I would travel by train to Valkenrad, Belgium, as I retraced the same train ride that my mom had taken 45 years ago when she first visited Harold's grave. I bought my ticket and waited on the train to arrive at the station in Liège. Upon my arrival at Valkenrad, I decided that I would hike the 10 kilometers, or 6 miles, from the train station to the cemetery in order to get a feel for what a foot soldier had to endure on a cold, rainy day. As I began walking, I sensed how small and lonely being a foot soldier must have been. You feel very exposed. You were not in a tank or an airplane. You were on the ground, exposed to both your enemy and the elements. The Belgian countryside offers lots of spots that can conceal the enemy. As I approached a village, I could imagine the places where a sniper would hide. The farmlands of Belgium are an easy place to get lost and disoriented. The hills and pastures all look the same in the eyes of a foreign soldier. The soldiers of World War II did not have a GPS or a cell phone. If they were lucky, maybe their unit had a walkie-talkie, which had an extremely short range. As I continued to hike, I got wet and cold, but I knew that I was going back to a warm hotel with a nice bed. Riflemen like Harold would be wet and cold for days, with only a foxhole to sleep in. After walking about 2 hours, I finally arrived at the cemetery. I was stunned by the sheer beauty of the Henri Chapelle American Military Cemetery. The grounds were like a beautifully manicured golf course. A friend of mine who's a West Point graduate told me to go to the superintendent's office and identify myself as the relative of a fallen soldier. I entered the large map room, which displayed the battles that the 7,992 men had given their lives to win. The map room was not a history lesson or a movie set. It was the reality of each man's sacrifice staring me right in the face. At the end of the map room was a glass door where I entered the office. I went in and introduced myself to the cemetery associate, Carolyn Oliver. I told her that I wanted to locate my second cousin's grave. I gave her a printout from the internet with Harold's grave location. She checked her computer, and with a bright smile, she looked up and said, "I found him." Then she went to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder with Harold's name on it. In the folder, she found the name and address of Harold's nephew, David Reeves, who had tried to visit the grave in 1999 but was unable to locate it when no one was in the cemetery office. The sound of David's name gave me great joy because I'd lost contact with him over the years. Caroline wrote down David's address for me and promised to put together the limited information that she had on Harold. Carolyn picked up a small American and Belgian flag that she would place at Harold's grave. Next, she proceeded just around the corner in her small office and picked up a bucket and a large jar of sand. As she poured the sand into the bucket, she explained that each cross has the soldier's name engraved in the marble, and in order for the soldier's name to be clearly seen in a photograph, the engraving would need to be filled with sand from the jar. Carolyn said, "The only sand that will go in the grave markers is the sand from the D-Day beaches in Normandy." In an instant, I was overcome with emotion. One of our nation's greatest military triumphs, the D-Day landings in June 1944, would be used to honor our family's sacrifice. At that very moment, I began to grasp the enormity of these hallowed grounds. As I prepared to walk out on the cemetery grounds, I had no clue what a powerful effect the next few moments would have on my life and the lives of many others that I had yet to meet. Caroline and I left the office and went outside to the point where the monument overlooks the 57-acre cemetery. Your breath is absolutely taken away when you see the 7,992 crosses that fill the final resting place for men who paid the ultimate sacrifice for your freedom. Even though only one of those was my relative, each cross is someone's relative who did not come home. This ground is filled with young men whose lives were cut tragically short. Every American should visit one of these overseas cemeteries to see firsthand the high price of freedom and to carefully consider their personal response to any future wars or military actions. There is no glory in war, only death and destruction. As I walked through the middle of the cemetery, Carolyn explained that the cemetery was much larger in 1945, when it contained the graves of 17,332 U.S. soldiers, plus over 10,000 German soldiers who were buried in the temporary cemetery at the same approximate location. The German soldiers' remains were relocated to Lommel, Belgium after the war. In 1947, there was a program where the American government offered to repatriate any soldier's remains to the United States at no cost to their family. Each next of kin had the opportunity to request repatriation if they so desired. Harold had married Helen Mittelstadt immediately before he left for Europe. She decided that it was best to leave Harold with his comrades in arms, where he would be taken care of in perpetuity, and his sacrifice would be remembered by all who visit. Carolyn had told me while walking down to Harold's grave that if I went anywhere in the town of Henri Chapelle, that I'd be treated like a king, because the town had been liberated by the American Army in September 1944. The population had been treated harshly by the Germans during their occupation. I had just walked through the village and found this monument in downtown Henri Chapelle. It stated, "Deposited here are the anonymous ashes that were collected at the Dachau concentration camp crematorium." Carolyn said, "We will never forget the sacrifices that America made for our freedom." We continued walking to the rear of the cemetery. As Carolyn approached his grave, I saw it before she even got there. I shouted out, "There he is! There he is! PFC, Harold B. McCarn." She carefully cleaned off his cross while I stood in the cold, light Belgian rain. Next, Carolyn placed the American and Belgian flags on either side of the white marble cross. Then she reached into her bucket and began to place the sand from the D-Day beaches at Normandy into Harold's marker. To my untrained eye, it looked like she was making a big mess. Then as she brushed off the excess sand, his name came alive. At the sight of Harold's name, I was overcome with emotion. I started sobbing on Carolyn's shoulder. I tried to get myself under control. I apologized, but continued to weep uncontrollably. She said that the cemetery was so honored to have a Noak, a next of kin, on the grounds, and that my response was quite normal for Noaks visiting for the first time. She explained that the cemetery has over 100,000 visitors a year, but only 120 are family members. She said it was an honor to escort me to Harold's grave. On the cross, I saw the date that Harold was killed in action, March the 16th, 1945. Germany surrendered on May the 8th, 1945. Harold died just 53 days short of the end of World War II in Europe. From out of some deep corner in the back of my mind came a name that I must have heard as a child, Remagen. I turned to Carolyn and said, "I think he may have died taking a bridge at a place called Remagen." Carolyn carefully read the date and the unit number, now clearly visible on his marker. She said he was definitely not killed at Remagen. In fact, his unit, the 9th Armored Division, had captured the only bridge across the Rhine on March the 7th, 1945. According to Carolyn, he made it across the Rhine River deep into Germany. I thought to myself, maybe his sacrifice did make a difference in bringing the war to a close. I just asked to stay there and take some pictures. I needed to capture this important moment. I wanted to make sure that our family's future generations, Harold's fourth cousins, my grandchildren, would never forget the sacrifice that Harold and the other 7,991 men had made. Each white marble cross represented a family whose lives would never be the same. Little did I know at that time that I would have the great honor and privilege of getting to personally know dozens of families whose loved ones are buried at Henri Chapelle and the other American military cemeteries nearby. The cumulative grief and sorrow of these families is beyond human understanding. Over the decades of time, the sacrifices of these young men have been largely forgotten by a modern American society that never considers the cost of their extensive freedom. While standing alone at the end of that cold, rainy 57-acre cemetery, I knew that I had to share this story with all who would listen. When I arrived back at the office, Carolyn had been busy doing research into the World War II records that she had access to. She made copies of the action reports during Harold's final days after crossing the bridge at Remagen. It seemed that Harold was killed during the process of capturing the Autobahn east of the Rhine River. She put together a number of forms and various items so I could do some further investigation on Harold's time in the service. She invited me to attend the Memorial Day celebration at Henri Chapelle to witness how the nation of Belgium and the American military faithfully remembers Harold's sacrifice every year. At that point, I was completely emotionally exhausted. Carolyn shared that the cemetery had information about the personal lives of only 600 of the 7,992 men. She encouraged me to research Harold's life and to put together some information about him. She shares the life stories of these fallen soldiers with the Belgian school children when they come to visit the cemetery. Carolyn told me that she wants each child to know that these are not just marble crosses, but real men who came from America and died to free Belgium from Nazi oppression. Then I met Bobby Bell, the cemetery superintendent. Bobby is from Florida. He offered to give me a ride back to the train station. We had a wonderful discussion on the trip back to Valkenrath. I told him that prior to my visit, I thought I would just show up, visit Harold's grave, take a few pictures, and then that would be the end of it. But departing the cemetery, I realized that my journey had just begun. Bobby encouraged me. He said now I needed to find out who my second cousin really was and what his unit did during the war. The problem was I only knew Harold's parents, and I really didn't know very much about Harold. When I arrived at the train station, I would embark on this new journey to learn about Harold. I would find out that Harold's life was emblematic of the 275,000 citizen soldiers who came to Europe as replacements after the D-Day landings. Let me now share the story of Harold's life and how he contributed to the downfall and final defeat of Nazi Germany. You will find this emotional story both fascinating and captivating. The beautiful grounds of the Henri Chapelle American Military Cemetery are situated far from the places that the 7,992 men had called home. This former Belgian farmland is now Harold's final resting place, but it was not his home. Harold and the other men fought and died in the famous battles nearby, the Hütgen Forest, the Battle of the Bulge, and the taking of the bridge at Remagen. Now they lay at rest on the continent of Europe, where all of them had drawn their last breath. Harold's childhood home lay 4,300 miles away in the state of North Carolina. Harold's family was from Randolph County, North Carolina. As a young boy, Harold and my mother played with their many other cousins when they visited their grandfather Stout's house. Just down the road was the Shiloh Church, where Harold played on Sunday afternoons when they had dinner on the grounds or family reunions. Harold grew up not far from the Stout homestead. It was a short trip with his parents through the town of Erect and then on to Coleridge, where he grew up. Harold B. McCarn was born in Randolph County, North Carolina on February 14, 1923. His parents were Bernice and Nina McCarn. Harold had a sister, Jewel, who was 4 years younger, and a brother, Charles, who was 6 years younger. As a boy, Harold lived in Coleridge. Coleridge was an old mill town, like many others in the area, that were located along the river to take advantage of the cheap hydropower. Harold's dad was a teacher and principal at the local school. My mother was the same age as Harold and was a close playmate growing up. The stock market crash in 1929 triggered the Great Depression. Times were financially hard all over America. The McCarn family relocated from Coleridge to Elon, North Carolina. Harold attended Elon College. For a period of time, Harold lived with my Aunt Cladybell Craven in High Point, North Carolina. 68 years later, at age 94, she still has good memories of Harold. She said, "He was such a nice young man, and it was so sad that he was killed during the war." Many of the other people who knew Harold have passed away, but some of the memories of Harold are still alive in David Reeves' mind as he remembers the stories that his grandmother Nina shared about his Uncle Harold.
I seem to recall that once again, this is a story that is so long ago that I may have parts of it wrong, but I just seem to recall that the family was down to like $1 and they needed bread or some kind of some groceries or something, and they and I think they sent Harold to the grocery store, and I think he lost the money somehow, and I don't know exactly what happened, but that it was a pretty desperate situation to having lost, and I think it was just $1, and I think that he lost the money on the way to the grocery store. Something happened, but whatever the story was, I'm pretty sure that it was Harold, and I'm pretty sure that he lost it, and I'm pretty sure everyone was pretty upset with him.
David, just like myself, we were both born after Harold had been killed in action, but his mother Nina made sure his memory was kept alive in David's mind, and he shares some of the thoughts and memories he has that his grandmother shared.
To me, Harold was the guy that made the cool model boat that sat upstairs in the bedroom that I slept in.
Right.
There was this wooden model boat sitting on a dresser that I always wanted.
And that was it.
And they always told me, don't touch that. That's something that Uncle Harold built. And it's going to stay here, that's prize. And it was really neat because it was a really cool, it was a little motorboat. It was made out of wood. It was really nicely built. It had to be like a 1.5 feet long, 18 inches or so. All right. That and the photograph of his on the piano downstairs in their house. But it was a formal picture. It was nice. His hair was really nice. He was very good looking, and it was not just it wasn't a snapshot. It was like a posed picture.
Harold's grave marker at Henri Chapelle indicates he was from Maryland, not North Carolina. This is how he ended up living in Maryland. After the outbreak of World War II, the Glenn L. Martin Company of Baltimore, Maryland, began gearing up its production of both seaplanes and the new B-26 bomber. The Martin aircraft factories required a huge workforce of new employees to meet their ever-expanding production quotas. One of Martin's biggest problems was keeping workers on the factory floor, as many were joining and are being drafted into the armed forces. Because of this, the workforce would experience a 25 to 50% annual turnover rate during the war. To make sure they had enough workers, the Glen L. Martin Company sent recruiters to central North Carolina and other locations. Bernice, Nina, and Harold McCarn all received job offers at the B-26 factory. The family moved to Baltimore, Maryland, while Harold's sister, Jewel, remained in North Carolina to complete her senior year of high school. The Martin factory was an extremely busy place during World War II. Many other people from North Carolina went to work for Martin, including some of my other relatives. Ultimately, both Harold's mom and dad would retire from Martin and its successor companies. Nina held a top secret clearance and would never discuss the details of what she did for a living with her grandchildren. Harold was working at the Martin B-26 plant prior to being inducted in the United States Army in June of 1944. Harold would leave civilian life and become a citizen soldier to take part in the liberation of Europe. Just like tens of thousands of other men during World War II, Harold joined the Army. He left his job as an assembly line worker at the Martin B-26 plant in Baltimore, Maryland, and traveled to Fayetteville, North Carolina, where he was inducted into the Army on June 24, 1944, at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He was sent to Camp Blanding in Stark, Florida, for training at the new Infantry Replacement Training Center. Harold would undergo a rigorous 17-week training course to become a rifleman. During the making of this film, I met Sergeant B.J. Ragsdale. Although Sergeant Ragsdale did not know Harold, he was from Central North Carolina and worked at the Martin B-26 plant in Baltimore prior to serving in the 2nd Armored Division of the U.S. Army during World War II. Sergeant Ragsdale recounts his trip to Camp Blanding for training. How'd you actually get to Camp Blanding?
Put me on a bus.
From Asheboro?
Yeah.
And you take a bus all the way to Camp Blanding? There in Florida? Or do you remember?
I believe we did stop at Fort Bragg and picked up some.
Right.
We went through Fort Bragg and then got down looked like halfway to Florida, and then a group went to the right in the Air Force, and we went to the infantry.
When the men arrived at Camp Blanding, they were handed a beautiful little blue handbook called the IRTC Handbook. First, it had a guide to the insignia of the commissioned and non-commissioned officers. Next, it had a section about the activities available at the camp. It talked about day rooms, the bowling alleys, and the swimming area. All the great, enjoyable, fun things to do while you're training for combat in Europe. But when you got to page 5, the seriousness of the Blue Handbook completely changed. You are here as a trainee because your country is engaged in a life and death struggle with one of the most powerful and ruthless combinations of powers the world has ever known, referring to the Axis powers. Our enemies are tough, cruel, and highly trained. Their defeat is essential before this world can become a decent place in which to live. The last paragraph became ominous for many men who trained at Camp Blanding. Your officers and non-commissioned officers are vitally interested in your progress and will assist you in a complete understanding of each phase of instruction. Learn your lessons well during your training and avoid having your mistakes marked by a cross on the battlefield. The men who trained at Camp Blanding during 1944 would experience huge casualty rates during combat in Europe, somewhere between 25 to 50%. During the 17 weeks of training, the recruits worked together learning the basics of being a combat rifleman. The barracks at Camp Blanding were far better than what Harold would see in the battlefields of Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. The most important lesson was learning to shoot the M1 carbine, which was the primary rifle for the United States Army. The men trained in the palmetto and pine trees during the hot, burning summer heat in Florida, not knowing that a blistering blizzard would be awaiting them in Europe. They would learn about the half-tracks, used in the armored infantry battalions to rush men from one battle to the other. At the end of the 17 weeks, each man would receive a certificate. I estimated that Harold began his training on the 10th of July, 1944, and graduated on November the 3rd, 1944. Sergeant Ragsdale has vivid memories of the hot summer of 1944 at Camp Blanding. He says he was glad to be sent to the cold in Europe.
Now, did you go through like the 17-week rifleman course and then do some stuff for tank destroyer also?
It had nothing to do with tank destroyer. It was strictly infantry all the way.
Okay, all the way.
Yeah, we didn't get above the 50 caliber at Camp Blanding.
Well, let's see, you would probably got down there sometime in the summer of 44. So pretty hot?
Pretty hot. Yeah, it was hot. In July, I went in July. Well, you can imagine what it was in August right down.
Training out there.
20-mile march down there in that sand.
Oh, goodness. That must have been horrible.
It was. I really, going overseas wasn't a real bad option.
That's what I couldn't believe is like all this heat and then to go to winter in Europe.
Yeah.
The training in Florida had nothing to do with where you went in Europe.
Well, they sent me to Europe by way of the North Sea, and that was cold on a British ship alone. And of course we zigzagged because there was subs in the waters up there.
Mm-hmm.
While Harold and the other men were training during the second half of 1944 at Camp Blanding, major events were happening in Europe. After D-Day, the Allied forces continued to move inland. In September 1944, Operation Market Garden was launched to liberate Holland. It was the largest airborne operation ever attempted up to that point in time. Unfortunately, on the northern edge at the city of Arnhem, the British forces were unsuccessful and had to retreat with almost 80% of the men killed or captured. To the south of Arnhem, there was success. Many cities became liberated in September 1944, including the city of Maastricht in Holland, the city of Liège in Belgium, and Luxembourg City. The Allies continued the advance and attacked the first German city, Aachen. After a bitter fight, on October 21, 1944, the United States Army captured Aachen. This produced a major morale boost. The lines began to form in anticipation of a spring offensive to cross the Rhine River. This news obviously traveled back to all the soldiers training in America. At Camp Blanding, I am certain that there was an atmosphere of optimism and hope that victory in Europe would be coming shortly. For the men who were trained as replacements, their life would be very lonely. They were replacements. They knew no one, and nobody wanted to make friends with someone who might be killed the next day. That was one of the most graphic memories of the war for Sergeant Ragsdale.
The other people that I've talked to, and my second cousin, same thing. A lot of men trained there at Camp Blanding, all sent out as replacements. So you showed up Europe not knowing anybody, basically, is what I gather.
I didn't know anybody. I didn't know a single soul. After we left here, a few of the guys went in from Ashburn when I did. And once I got to Camp Blanding, I didn't see a living soul there that I'd ever known. Nor did I ever see anybody that I knew in the States until I got back to, I never did.
So they're all strangers.
Yeah, well, of course, Dan Thomas and my brother-in-law and I were in the same town, but we didn't know it until after the war. And I didn't see anybody in the service that I grew up with or knew.
Yeah, and you ended up getting assigned to the U.S. Second Armored Division. Is that
That's right?
Yeah. Okay, that's Second Armored.
Yeah.
So you went from Aachen and then worked your way towards Berlin progressively.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. And did you cross the Rhine River up kind of to the north around the Ruhr pocket, sort of towards?
We were a bit north. Yeah.
Yeah.
Harold was ready to head off to Europe. He received the customary delayed departure, which gave him 2 weeks to make his journey from Camp Blanding to New York City to board a troop ship for Europe. He traveled to Baltimore, Maryland to visit his family and to get married. He married Helen Mittelstadt. During that time, it was very common for men going to war to marry their girlfriends, have a short honeymoon, and then head off to Europe. Harold boarded a troop ship in New York Harbor and sailed the North Atlantic. Upon arriving in Europe, Harold was assigned to the 60th Armored Infantry Battalion of the 9th Armored Division. Harold arrived in Europe as a replacement rifleman. I cannot tell you the exact date when Harold joined his unit or what he personally did each day of the war because I simply do not have those records. However, I do have the entire after-action report for the 60th Armored Infantry Battalion. We will follow the steps of Harold's unit, Company A, from the Battle of the Bulge to the crossing of the bridge at Remagen and the capturing of the Autobahn east of the Rhine River. Let us begin with the combat actions of Company A during the Battle of the Bulge. The 9th Armored Division took spots along this line. Obviously, they were spread very thin along such a lengthy front. The men thought they were just there to acclimate to the bitter, cold winter weather. They were told by their superior officers that nothing was going to happen except for an occasional skirmish. In the spring, the unit would head for the Rhine River to launch the assault into the German heartland and hopefully end the war. On the German side, Hitler had a completely different plan. Realizing his options were limited, he gathered all the battle-hardened troops he could find to face these green, untried recruits. He would assemble these units in great secrecy. Then, along the border where the 9th Armored Division was defending, the German panzers would launch a three-pronged offensive with the objective to capture the port of Antwerp. The Germans planned to encircle the American armies, then sue for conditional peace. The first wave of panzers would come from the north to encircle Antwerp. Then a second wave of troops would come through Luxembourg on the southern flank. Finally, through the center section, a third group would make a frontal assault on Antwerp. The German objectives must be achieved rapidly, otherwise the plan would fail. The men of the 60th Armored Infantry Battalion had no clue what was about to take place. On the morning of December 16, 1944, Company A of the 60th Armored Infantry Battalion was dug in on top of the hills overlooking Dillingen, Luxembourg. Hello, I'm here in Germany. Right across and behind from me is Dillingen, Luxembourg. And the bridge that you see was where the German army crossed on December the 16th, 1944 to begin the Battle of the Bulge. And the hills that you see behind me were defended by the 60th Armored Infantry Battalion. This is where it all started. They began to defend this area, and they were told it would be an area with not a whole lot of action, but they started by a huge artillery barrage and then overwhelming crossing of enemies. And even though they were dug in, they would not be able to hold this position and would eventually fall back to another position further across the hill in Beaufort, Luxembourg. I was able to locate one of the men who survived the attacks of that cold morning in 1944. PFC Ralph Youngman was dug in on the hill overlooking the river with the other members of Company A on December the 16th, 1944. Listen to his eyewitness account of the opening artillery barrage.
So on the morning of the 16th, I had just got off of guard duty, and we used to pull guard duty just outside of our dugout that we slept in. So the whole squad slept in one dugout. 12 men in one big dugout they had, and it was like 6 foot deep and with big logs over the top. Very good shelter, really. Didn't get wet hardly at all. This other friend took it, and I crawled into my sack and was just about trying to get back to sleep again when all hell broke loose. This is like 5:30 in the morning or something. Shells coming in from everywhere, just busting. And the guy that was the friend of mine that was on guard duty, he says, "Boy," he says, "you got to come up here and see this." He said, "My God, it's like the 4th of July." He said, "There's flashes all over." Well, I stuck my head out. I didn't stay out there very long, but the stuff was busting all over in the treetops and shattering artillery shell, the fragments down. And neither one of us stayed up there very long. We got down in the hole, and of course by that time everybody was awake and talking to the squads out front, and they were telling us they're getting hit pretty hard. And this went on for a good half hour, I don't know, 45 minutes maybe. And then it all stopped.
On the top of the hill overlooking Dillingen, Luxembourg. Hear this beautiful babbling brook in the background. But in December 1944, the 60th Armored Infantry Battalion was not hearing that because they were being shelled as the Germans prepared to cross that bridge. And in the hills behind me, they're full of foxholes where an entire company of men, and then later a second company of men. It started out with the Company A, which is what Harold was a member of, filled this entire hill as they attempt to stop the Germans. And there's a beautiful sign just to the right of me, I'll show you a couple pictures from it, telling about the events of December 1944 and the heroic efforts of the 60th Armored Infantry Battalion. It is hard to imagine what the soldiers of Company A experienced during their first day of combat, but their commanding officer recorded all the details. On December the 16th, they were awoke at 6:30 in the morning by a 1,000-round artillery barrage. Now imagine that one company has a total of approximately 150 men. The report says that the attacking force was estimated at 2 German infantry regiments. That would equal roughly 5,000 Germans crossing the river and heading up the hill to where 150 Americans were. That is a 33-to-1 ratio. Devastating results awaited the men of Company A. The trees are very thick on top of the hill, making it easy for the Germans to attack Company A's position. Company B was called forward, but soon both companies became trapped as the Germans overran their positions.
But because they were coming up a very steep hill up to where we were right at the top of the hill, we were in perfect position. Finally, they hit us from the right, I think, this time. And we were spread out so thin, we couldn't even see the outfit on our right or the outfit on our left. We were spread way out. I don't know how many miles our company was in, but they were spread way the hell out. A couple of our guys got hit. One squad was completely surrounded, and they were captured. The first or second charge that came up, they were taken. It was our machine gun squad. So we tried to contact them, and we had no contact with them. They were gone. They were our first real casualties of the Battle of the Bulge that I know of. But it was very frightening, no matter what the hell it was, especially kids that had never seen this that much firefight all while we were there.
What I want to show you, I hope I can demonstrate this successfully here, is let's just say you're marching down here. It looks a pretty innocent place, but watch what happens and how even a big guy like me, I can seemingly disappear. Boom! And from out of nowhere, a German soldier pops out. That's a very scary place to be. PFC Ralph Youngman recounts his deadly encounter with a German sniper hiding in the woods that day in Luxembourg.
We found out that there was a sniper up in a tree. Our lieutenant told my sergeant, who was Ray Lancaster, also from Cleveland, was my sergeant. So he and I and two other fellows were told to go up and see if we could find a sniper. So we circled around our position and came up on a left flank trying to see him. And again, it's all full of trees. There's trees everywhere. Well, we got up where we could hear firing. And we were laid out, four of us were laid out in a skirmish line. And we were shooting in that general direction. But I really didn't see anything to shoot at. When the first few shots that went off, the sergeant was on my right. He got shot through the helmet. He was killed immediately. The fellow on my left was also shot. Well, about this time, why, I got hit. And I was laying under my rifle, firing my rifle in prone position. And I got hit in the left shoulder, across the shoulder, and across my back. Started to crawl back from where I were, and I hollered at the other guys. I said, we better drop back. None of them moved. I finally crawled back to our platoon dugout, and I told them there what happened. And I said, I think there's at least two of them that are killed up there. And I said, I think there's other two are wounded. They said, well, we'll get the medics. So they called the medics. And by this time, they were putting a field bandage on my thing. And one of the medics says, well, I'll go up there and see what we can do. So two of them went up there. And I was told then later that both of them were shot and killed.
The 60th Armored Infantry Battalion could not hold the line against the superior force, so they began fighting a defensive battle against the advancing Germans. In the minds of this untested American unit, they were losing the war, but what they didn't know was that they were slowing down the German timetable. These delaying actions, fought by thinly stretched American soldiers up and down the lines of the Battle of the Bulge would ultimately result in the Nazi defeat. The men fought in horrible winter conditions. I saw this picture at Camp Blanding depicting the cold winter conditions that the men had to endure during December 1944. This 1945 newspaper clipping shows where the 60th Armored Infantry Battalion was when this all began. Note that the censors changed the date to December 17th, not the 16th. As the battalion fell back, their next major battle was in the area around Savelborn, Luxembourg, from December 21st to the 26th. The enemy repeatedly attacked the 60th Armored Infantry Battalion. There were German soldiers who could speak English that were disguised in American uniforms, and they tried to infiltrate the lines by crossing at the bridge shown in this painting. Each attack by the Germans was repulsed by the 60th Armored Infantry Battalion, but the Americans suffered heavy losses during each attack. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon of December 26th, the battalion was ordered to withdraw to Belgium. At 15 minutes before midnight on December 26th, they took up their new positions just outside Bastogne, near Cibret, Belgium. 10 days into the campaign, it had become clear to the German commanders that they had failed in their attempt to take Antwerp. So they surrounded the Americans on Christmas Day 1944 at Bastogne, Belgium. The day after Christmas, the 60th Armored Infantry Battalion took up their new defensive positions. They had to hold the line so that the relief columns could come in and free the 101st Airborne that was trapped at Bastogne. They fought bravely and held the line until January the 3rd, 1945, when they were relieved. As a result of their efforts during the Battle of the Bulge, the 9th Armored Division received the Presidential Citation for Valor. Hello, I'm in Cibret, Belgium. And in January the 3rd, 1945, the 60th Armored Infantry Battalion was finally relieved and sent to the rear, because even though they started fighting on the German border and had backed up all the way across Luxembourg into Belgium protecting the city of Bastogne, they had delayed the Nazi advance and stopped the Battle of Bulge, and Harold's unit, even after catastrophic losses, finally got a break and would be sent to the rear in preparation for their assault on the bridge at Remagen. The Battle of the Bulge became legendary. The relief of the 101st Airborne was so dramatic that a monument was erected in Bastogne. It lists each unit that helped repel the German attack as the city was surrounded. Featured prominently is the 9th Armored Division, but the men of the 60th Armored Infantry Battalion suffered horrible losses. Out of the 1,000 men that had taken up positions along the hills of northeastern Luxembourg, 492 of them had become casualties in only 19 days of combat. Now the battalion had to pull back and wait for replacements prior to attacking the Germans at the Rhine River. After the successful relief of the trapped soldiers of the 101st Airborne in Bastogne, Company A was relieved. They left Cibret, Belgium on January the 3rd, 1945 and marched to the rear in France. The 60th Armored Infantry Battalion was billeted in Distrolf, France, where they spent time waiting for the all-important replacements and supplies to bring the devastated battalion back up to fighting strength. In only 3 weeks of combat, the battalion had suffered 492 casualties, reducing them to half of their normal fighting strength. After replacements and supplies arrived, the battalion began training in preparation for the assault on the Rhine River. Harold actually celebrated his 22nd birthday in France on Valentine's Day 1945. On February the 23rd, 1945, orders came to march north to Troyes, Belgium, near Liège. This would be the launching point for the planned assault on the heartland of Germany. The men certainly knew upon arrival in Troyes that they would be preparing to assault the Germans at the Rhine River. But what they didn't know was what was taking place 26 miles directly to the north of Troyes. At a farm near the small Belgian village of Henri Chapelle, the 607th Graves Registration Unit had been laboring day after day since September 1944, burying fallen soldiers at a temporary American military cemetery. In exactly 1 month, the cemetery would be full, and the last of the 27,553 fallen soldiers would be buried there. Some of the very men of the 60th Armored Infantry Battalion would be in that number, and one of those would be PFC Harold B. McCarn. The battle for the Hütgen Forest began in September 1944 and had ended just 18 days earlier on February the 10th, 1945. Prior to securing the forest, the Army had to make it through the defenses of the Siegfried Line and its huge anti-tank barriers. Then they entered the Hütgen Forest, which became a killing field for the men there. The soldiers encountered the deadly effects of German artillery, which would explode above their foxholes, shearing off the tops of the trees, which would fall over 100 feet, impaling the men below. The soldiers who fought to secure the forest paid a very high price, 33,000 casualties for the Americans and 28,000 for the Germans. Now the road through the forest was secure. The 60th Armored Infantry Battalion headed safely through the forest into the lowlands to position for their assault on the Rhine River. You see the little bit of edge of hills. Now we're into what's called the lowlands or the flatlands. It's obvious to see you could drive a tank, a truck, anything across here much faster than you could in the forest. This was the reason that the Army went through here. Once they finally broke through, the only thing that would stop them would be the Rhine River. General Eisenhower and his staff knew the days of Nazi Germany were numbered. They planned an offensive which they hoped would bring the war in Europe to a swift close with the minimum number of Allied casualties. The plan was to send two groups in an encircling movement to trap the Germans in the industrial region known as the Ruhr Pocket around Cologne, Germany. The 9th Armored Division was to fight their way from Drova, Germany to Koblenz in order to link up with General Patton's army and launch an amphibious assault across the Rhine River. Far to the north of Cologne, American, British, and Canadian forces would cross to the north. The two groups would then begin an encircling movement trapping the Germans in the Ruhr Pocket. Once the Germans became trapped, planners believed the war in Europe would come to a swift close. So orders filtered down to the 60th Armored Infantry Battalion, head to Koblenz and prepare for an amphibious assault across the Rhine River. They were told that all bridges would be blown by the Germans, and a costly amphibious assault was the only option.
Army planners were very concerned with one major point. There was a series of dams located on the east side of the Hurtgen Forest. They dammed up the Ruhr River. If those dams were open, it would flood the entire lowlands area, making travel by armored vehicle, truck, or even by foot impossible, and blocking the Rhine River from the United States Army. At the start of the offensive, the 78th Infantry Division captured both dams and secured them, allowing the 9th Armored Division to run straight across that area, heading in the direction of Koblenz. They captured town after town after town if they moved across the plains of the lowlands during the first portion of March.
Forward elements of the 9th Armored Division continued to move rapidly across Germany. On March the 7th, 1945, one of those forward elements approached the town of Remagen. From the bluff overlooking the town, the soldiers were absolutely shocked to see a fully intact bridge over the Rhine River. They radioed headquarters and were ordered to capture and then hold the town of Remagen. Contrary to what they'd been told, there was a bridge still standing. They would no longer have to make an amphibious assault, but could cross the Rhine River on the Ludendorff Railway Bridge. Listen as General Eisenhower recounts the significance of securing the bridge at Remagen.
Every major victory in war is a result of long planning, long preparation, with the loss of often thousands of men. But when something comes along that is unexpected and you have this great prize, now there's a great alarm. In the other cases, you've expected it, you've planned for it, and here you come along with something that gives a great lift to the morale of the whole force, everybody. I think from private up to our bosses in Washington and London knew that the war was over. Every one of us realized that if Hitler had the slightest sense, he would immediately surrender. But it was the gallantry of the men that did it is something that should never be forgotten. And their names really ought to be in some, I'd say, permanent place in the niche of fame that the American government should like to keep.
On March the 7th, 1945, just 10 miles to the west of the town of Remagen, Harold's unit, the 60th Armored Infantry Battalion, had captured the city of Landenshofe. They took the town and captured a number of prisoners. The battalion rested there on the evening of March the 7th, unaware of what had occurred at Remagen in the late afternoon. They expected to continue their attack the next morning further to the south in the direction of Koblenz. Overnight, Harold's commanding officer received the word that a bridge at Remagen had been seized. The 60th Armored Infantry Battalion was told to move out immediately to the town of Sinzig in order to protect the southern flank of the bridgehead from counterattacks by the German army. The news of the bridge came as a complete surprise to the unit. They must have been overjoyed with the thought of finding a bridge so they would not have to make an amphibious assault across the Rhine River. Harold's turn to cross the Rhine River at Remagen would come shortly. The bridge that was found at Remagen was actually the Ludendorff Railway Bridge. It was a very rugged structure that consisted of 4 major parts. First were the west towers, which anchored the bridge to the west side of the Rhine. Then there was a superstructure that supported trains for the crossing of the Rhine. On the east side was another set of towers that anchored the bridge, and finally there was a train tunnel. The bridge was built very close to a small mountain, and the trains had to make a tight 90-degree turn to the north after crossing the bridge. So a tunnel was built through the mountain. During the battle, the tunnel became a point of refuge for both sides. The superstructure eventually collapsed and fell into the Rhine. Both towers are still standing today. The West Tower houses a peace museum, which contains historical information on the battle. Directly behind the East Tower is the tunnel entrance. Inside the tunnel entrance, a movie about the bridge is shown on certain evenings. The tunnel exit now lays hidden underneath the growth of several decades. The 27th Armored Infantry Battalion of the 9th Armored Division made it across the bridge late on the afternoon of March the 7th, 1945. From the interrogation of German prisoners, they learned that the bridge was wired with explosives and was scheduled for demolition that afternoon. As they approached the bridge, there was a large explosion in front of the ramp leading to the West Tower. The blast created a large crater, but they were able to work their way around it. Later, a second explosion was set off by the Germans to destroy the bridge, but the explosives that had been placed on the bridge were of a low grade. Once the smoke of the detonation cleared, to the shock of both the Germans and the Americans, the bridge was still standing. The American soldiers began to cross the Ludendorff Railway Bridge, cutting wires as they moved across to the east side of the Rhine River. They disabled a machine gun position in the East Tower. The German Bridge Defense Company and the remaining people of the town had withdrawn into the security of the train tunnel, but finally they surrendered. The next most important task was to establish a bridgehead on the east side of the Rhine to prepare for the German counterattacks. Over the next 10 days, soldiers crossed in large quantities and began to assemble on the east side of the Rhine to continue their offensive by capturing the Autobahn and starting the encirclement of the German army in the Ruhr pocket. Listen to Dale Maurer as he recounts his crossing of the bridge at Remagen.
Bombs came in and shells, and we all took cover, but hurried back to our vehicles and got back in them and went back down closer to the bridge.
Right.
We pulled up to the bridge. A lone MP was on duty. A lieutenant came out and saluted and said, "Good luck."
Good luck.
At the post, the bridge gate.
Yeah, where the big towers were.
So we took off. He said, "Keep your interval." And there were, I think we had 3 radio cars in the lead vehicle. We took off in the Jeep, and we got about halfway across. There was reconstruction going on. They had a crew out there really laying more lumber on the floor,
right,
and things like that, so they could bring tanks and vehicles across. And there was a well-known major, apparently, I saw his name in the paper, who was in charge in a trench coat, and I learned later was a hero of the whole affair. But we passed him, and he gave us a salute, and then a little farther on, some heavy fire came in. It hit the vehicle in front of us and ours, and one behind, but ours was still mobile enough to
keep
make
on
it
going
across. It had a tank or two in front of them had gotten hit. We pulled off at the far end of the bridge. There was a tunnel where the tunnel goes in, left the track and the railroad track, and went into the.
Did you go inside the tunnel? Yeah, because that was secure.
Took security in the tunnel for a little while, came back out and changed our tires, and a tank next to us got hit and blew it apart. And
the Ludendorff Railway Bridge collapsed into the Rhine River on March the 17th, 1945. 2 factors contributed to the bridge's collapse. First was the damage that resulted from the Germans' attempt to blow the bridge. Second was the heavy weight of the lumber that had been laid down on the railway bridge so that armored units could cross. Unfortunately, when the bridge collapsed, Army engineers were trying to reinforce it. 28 U.S. Army engineers were killed and 93 others were injured when the bridge unexpectedly fell. You can see in this picture, taken a few days later, that the bridge superstructure is gone, but not before several thousand U.S. Army soldiers had crossed over to the east side of the Rhine. Prior to the collapse, a pontoon bridge was assembled slightly to the north of the Ludendorff Railway Bridge. Also, a ferry service began moving men, equipment, and the wounded back and forth across the Rhine. I am standing here at the base of the bridge at Remagen. To me, it's like hallowed ground. This structure and the structure of the tower on the other side are basically what's left from the railway bridge. To me, it's like hallowed ground. It's sort of the end of a journey. To be able to, it's one thing to talk about history, but it's a whole other thing to touch it. And it really hits home the sacrifice that was made. Because after he would cross over that bridge, he would head right up that way, just a few miles, and be killed in action. Thank you for your sacrifice, Harold, and all your friends who gave us freedom.
Miles around converged on the bridgehead, and within 24 hours, 8,000 American soldiers had crossed the Remagen Bridge.
Harold's unit, the 60th Armored Infantry Battalion, would be called up from their defensive position just south of the Remagen Bridge. They would leave the city of Zinzig and move to a position on the west bank of the Rhine River, then cross over at Remagen to the east side of the Rhine. From there, they would move forward through the cities of Erpel, Unckel, and finally into the city of Rheinbreitbach, where they would be attached to the 311th Infantry Regiment of the 78th Infantry Division to position for an assault on the next objective, Bad Honnef.
On the east side of the Rhine, I have the bridge in sight. I'm on the road that Harold walked on. He walked his death on this road to die for me and to free there. It's really hard. I see the tower. I see the hill. He gave his life so we could be free. It's really, really hard. I am here. Oh, it's so hard.
Once the men had crossed the Rhine River, they had to quickly expand the bridgehead or be killed in an ensuing German counterattack. There was simply no room for all the men in the small area between the east tower and the cliff overlooking it. The 60th Infantry Regiment soon controlled the hill overlooking the east tower. Some units moved south along the edge of the Rhine River. They continued further south to capture the town of Linz. The majority of the troops were sent to the north of the East Tower. First, they battled their way through the German town of Erpel. Next, up the river was Unckel, Germany. Finally, they secured the town of Bad Honnef as they expanded the bridgehead. Once Bad Honnef was secured, the army units prepared to attack the Autobahn. The German supply lines had to be severed at the Autobahn, otherwise the operation to encircle the Germans in the Ruhr pocket would fail. Harold's unit would be on the front lines fighting their way north along the Rhine River in preparation to attack the Autobahn. I'm on the overlook that overlooks the Rhine River. Not my kind of thing. If I go about 2 meters, I fall straight down to my death about 800 feet, and anybody who knows me knows I hate heights. But this is an important scene. What you see behind me, right up there, is where Harold's unit and Harold, Company A of the 60th Armored Infantry Battalion, marched northward along the Rhine River. And if you see the village way in the distance, then they turn right, because what's to the right is east. and east is where the Autobahn, which was their objective, to capture that Autobahn on the 16th of March 1945, and to retrace someone's literal death march is overwhelming. You cannot put that in words when you know that somebody marched down that road that you see to die for us, to die for our freedom, and to end this horrible thing of World War II and the Nazi atrocities. It's a beautiful day today. But in March, that was something else. This place was devastated. It had been shelled, and it was just a rough time. But this gives you a picture, as you've seen from the maps, what actually happened to Harold. And next we'll go film, actually, where he was killed in action on the 16th of March, 1945. On March the 13th, 1945, the combined forces of the 311th Infantry Regiment and the 60th Armored Infantry Battalion began the attack on Bad Honnef. It became an intense struggle that would last for almost 3 days. Captain John Shales, Harold's commanding officer, recorded the intense fighting that occurred as the men struggled to penetrate the forest east of Bad Honnef. On March the 14th, he wrote about a terrific artillery barrage that was followed by a third enemy counterattack. Initially, the counterattack severed the road linking Company A and Company B. After 2 hours of hand-to-hand combat with bayonets fixed, the counterattack was repulsed, and both Company A and Company B were able to reconnect. On the 15th of March, units continued to fight eastward through the forest in the direction of the Autobahn. The Germans were not going to allow the Autobahn to be taken without a heavy price. Well, we're actually traveling south on the Autobahn that connects the Cologne area with Frankfurt. This was an important supply route for the Germans because it connected the industrial output around the Cologne area down south with further supplies in Frankfurt. If the Allies could sever this, it would quickly shorten the war. A dense forest was located between Bad Honnef and the Autobahn. The forest forced the men to fight as a basic infantry unit without the support of the half-tracks and tanks that they were accustomed to. Communications were difficult because their normal radios were still in the M3 half-tracks. As they cleared the forest and approached the Autobahn, the area began to open up. At 6 a.m. on March the 16th, 1945, Company A moved out to seize the Autobahn. They faced an intense German barrage from both artillery and anti-tank guns. By 3 o'clock on the afternoon of March the 16th, they had obtained their objective, the Autobahn. The next morning, the remaining Germans at the Autobahn surrendered. The Autobahn had been severed, and the encirclement of the Ruhr pocket could continue. Following the capture of the Autobahn, the Allied breakout was dramatic. On April the 4th, 1945, the north and south flanks of the Allied army met east of the Ruhr pocket, and 430,000 German soldiers were trapped. But the victory had come at the highest of prices for the 60th Armored Infantry Battalion. 694 casualties out of the 1,000 men in the battalion. Since engaging the Germans at Dillingen, Luxembourg, just 3 months earlier, the battalion had suffered a mind-staggering 1,186 casualties. Unfortunately now, PFC Harold B. McCarn was included in that number, as he lay dead at the edge of the Autobahn in Augustenburg, Germany. He was killed in action only 53 days short of the German surrender. Back in America, his parents, Bernice and Nina McCarn, were making preparations to travel from Baltimore, Maryland to Liberty, North Carolina for the 50th wedding anniversary of Harold's grandparents. They were completely unaware that Harold had been killed in action.
Came from small towns in rural America. They came from big cities across the land. They joined to fight for liberty and the freedoms they did not have. For they were young and they were bold. They carried their pride in their hearts and souls. For they knew that some won't be coming back to sacrifice for freedom. Freedom, freedom, let freedom ring across the land. Freedom, freedom, the greatest generation we ever had. From the ships, from the seas, they hit the shores, traveling across the land. From the skies they fell so heroically with a rifle in their hands. From the mountains they climb, to the forests they run, into the valleys below. Through the cities they fought for liberty and the freedoms we now all know. Freedom, freedom, let freedom ring across the land. Freedom, freedom, the greatest generation we ever had. And in their darkest hours they did fight. The bombs are bursting through the night. They stood their ground, for they dug in against all odds, but they did win. Freedom, freedom, let freedom ring across the land. Freedom, freedom, the greatest generation we ever had. By the rivers they crossed, through the cold waters of the Rhine, they pushed forward into Remagen. And in that town they fought for the bridge, crossing into freedom. The Autobahn lay not far away, objective within their reach. The highway to hell, one soldier yells out the last words he'll ever speak. Freedom, freedom, let freedom ring across the land. Freedom, freedom, the greatest generation we ever had. Now their bodies lie in graves overseas, forever in turn for all to see. They travel far and wide across the globe to pay their respects to thee. The road to freedom is never an easy path, it's secured by blood spilled on the ground. And I, for one, shall never forget the high price for freedom. Freedom, 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 let freedom ring across the land. Freedom, 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 the greatest generation we ever had. Freedom, freedom, let freedom ring across the land. Freedom, freedom, the greatest generation we ever had. From the ships, from the seas, they hit the shores, traveling across the land. From the skies they fell so heroically, with a rifle in their hands. From the mountains they climb, to the forest they run, into the valleys below. Through the cities they fought for liberty and the freedoms we now all know. Freedom, freedom, let freedom ring across the land. Freedom, freedom, the greatest generation we ever had. And in their darkest hours they did fight. The bombs are bursting through the night. They stood their ground, for they dug in against all odds, but they did win. Freedom, freedom, let freedom ring across the land. Freedom, freedom, the greatest generation we ever had. By the rivers they crossed, through the cold waters of the Rhine, they pushed forward into Remagen. And in that town they fought for the bridge.